The Via Stoica podcast with Brendan and Benny. Powered by viastoica.com, your home for coaching, workshops, quotes, and Stoic content that inspires. Welcome to the Via Stoica podcast. I'm your host, Benny. I'm joined by my good friend, Brendan, and today we have a very special guest. We are talking to someone we've been speaking to for a while on Spaces and on previous episodes. So we want to introduce Donald Robertson. Donald is an author, public speaker, and expert in cognitive behavioral therapy and Stoic philosophy. His new book is out now, and that's where we want to begin. It's called How to Think Like Socrates. And most of Donald's earlier books focus on CBT and Stoicism with a strong emphasis on Marcus Aurelius. Your most well-known book is probably How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. You also have a biography of Marcus Aurelius, a graphic novel, Verissimus. So, Donald, how do we get from Marcus Aurelius to Socrates? Can you walk us through that journey from Stoicism to Socratic philosophy?
Well, the short version is that I'd written 3 books in a row about Marcus Aurelius. So I kind of felt it was time that I wrote about some other dude for a change. And Socrates is actually my favorite philosopher. So Marcus Aurelius is a really interesting guy, but Socrates is just so much more complex and multifaceted and multi-layered and paradoxical as a figure. There's a lot more to kind of get your teeth into. But I think of Socrates as being kind of like the granddaddy or the godfather, you might say, of Stoicism, and even in a sense, the godfather of cognitive behavioral therapy, because it was Socrates that was known in the ancient world for really bringing philosophy. There were philosophers before him. There were philosophers at Athens before him. But Socrates was renowned for bringing philosophy down to earth and applying it to everyday ethical issues, and also turning philosophy as a process, into a kind of therapy. He said philosophy is like a therapy for a form of intellectual conceit. So he thought it was really about transforming our lives, and it has psychological implications as well as kind of intellectual or philosophical implications, to use his questioning method. So I see Socrates as kind of inspiring the therapeutic and self-improvement approaches that we find in Stoicism, and then all the way down through history into the modern self-help literature and modern psychotherapy.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you mentioned how central Socrates is. I was reading an article recently that said that the 2 most influential individuals in Western thought are Jesus Christ and Socrates. Would you agree with that
that's
comparison?
Fair, right? And what do they both have in common? Like, they were both executed. They're kind of similar characters. Many people have said they're similar in a sense. They kind of become martyrs. 400 years before Jesus Christ, Socrates was put on trial because he became a controversial figure, and they made him drink hemlock. And his death sent shockwaves through the ancient world. And Plato's account of, we have several accounts, we have two accounts. There are many accounts in the ancient world, some of which are lost now. But those accounts of Socrates' death, particularly Plato's Apology, were so influential. Like, every intellectual in the ancient world was familiar with this account of what Socrates said and did in court, and it was absolutely iconic. Inspired generations of young men afterwards to become philosophers. And for sure, we mentioned the Stoics. Like, all of the Stoics would probably have known almost like the back of their hand the content of Plato's Apology. It's beyond being it's the most profound, moving, and important philosophical text.
That's a great way to start this interview, and I wanted to build on that a little bit more. I'm listening to you talk about Socrates and his influence on the Stoics. I keep noticing a kind of imbalance in what's popular today. It feels like Stoicism is really on the rise, especially in its practical form. We talked about this in our previous conversations. People know the dichotomy of control, the daily practices, Marcus Aurelius, all of the quotes and all of that. But when I read your book and look how deeply someone like Socrates influenced the Stoics, it feels like the Socratic method and Socratic philosophy aren't nearly as visible or as popular. But maybe I'm looking in the wrong places, but that's how it seems to me.
The Socratic method is foundational. Socrates had this kind of, one of the issues that he addressed, let's say, was the dominant intellectuals of his period were known as the sophists. Their name comes from the Greek word sophia, that means wisdom. They were self-proclaimed wise men or experts. They had expertise and wisdom, and they charged hefty fees to impart that to other people. And they thought if they give someone a speech and teach them maxims, people would memorize those and they would become equally wise. And Socrates thought this was crazy, right? That we can't acquire wisdom just by memorizing a bunch of other people's opinions. Socrates thinks fundamentally wisdom is more like a cognitive skill. Like, it would be like going to the gym and lifting weights or something like that. You need to use your brain. I hate to break it to you kids, but you're going to have to think for yourselves, is basically what Socrates is saying to the youth of Athens, right? And I'm going to teach you to think for yourselves by asking you all these rigorous questions, like forcing you to really look at your assumptions anew and explore them from different perspectives. The sophists are just like modern influencers in a sense, right? People go on the internet and they watch videos and they memorize slogans and things like that. But again, it's incredibly passive. And Socrates wants to snap us out of this trance and get us to realize that the true wisdom consists in being able to think for yourself and to arrive at and justify your own conclusions. Now, I suppose there's a problem with Stoicism in that the Stoics used the Socratic method, but they were also keen to summarize sayings and maxims. And if we're not careful, a lot of the sources that we have for Stoicism might lead us to think of it as this kind of passive memorization of slogans as well, right? I mean, that's just the nature of the sources we have. Now, we do have the discourses of Epictetus, like that show him the transcripts of him talking to students. And we can see Epictetus actually using the Socratic method in those discussions, right? So we know even, 400 or 500 years later, when Epictetus is teaching, by the way, to Epictetus, Socrates is ancient history. That's like the late medieval period to us. This is like nearly 5 centuries before his time. But Epictetus still absolutely idolizes Socrates. He tells his students, first and foremost, you should be emulating Socrates as your role model, more before even Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. Right? How crazy is that? Marcus Aurelius as well thinks of Socrates as this iconic figure, right? Socrates is before Stoicism. He preceded the origins of Stoicism by about 100 years, but he's still seen by the Stoics as their forefather, in a sense, and their supreme role model, basically. So it's no surprise that you see Epictetus actually using a form of the Socratic method with his students. But we have less than 1%, a rough estimate, of ancient Stoic literature surviving today. Even Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, supposedly wrote 700 books or texts. They were probably like essays, right? 703 or something like that, right? None of them survive, right? So our knowledge of ancient Stoic literature is extremely limited, right? We mainly have stuff from Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, and then a bunch of other bits and pieces, basically. So it's not a representative sample, probably, of the literature that once existed in the ancient world, right? We've got a highly selective sample. And so we don't maybe see the extent to which they were actually doing philosophy. We see more like the conclusions that they arrived at, if you like, rather than the process that they went through. And I think one risk with that is that we turn Stoicism into a kind of theology, or like by that I mean a kind of bunch of dogmas, right, that are arrived at by a leap of faith or something. I know people talk about Stoicism as like a bunch of beliefs that they want to adopt, right, rather than opinions that they happen to agree with as a result of their own reasoning. Right. So the Stoics went through a process of reasoning. That's why I would say Stoicism is fundamentally a philosophy and not a religion. It has similarities to religion, but the Stoics didn't believe the things that they believe, even their theological and religious beliefs. They didn't believe them because they're written in a scripture. They didn't believe them because of some mystical revelation. No, they didn't believe them because of cultural tradition. They believed at them because they believed in the things that they believed about the gods, about the goal of life, because they'd engaged in philosophical debates about it, and those were the conclusions that they'd arrived at. Their religion is derivative from reason and not the other way round, right? And I think we kind of get it back to front a little bit. We see philosophy as the kind of handmaiden of theology, as it were, because of the Christian tradition. For the Stoics, it's the other way round. Philosophy comes first and foremost, Like it's reason that's the core. So the Socratic method would be essential to doing that, basically. Otherwise, we're like just like the sophists. We're just reading stuff and memorizing it. Socrates is emphatic. He says that's what, if you do that, what you get is opinion rather than knowledge. An opinion, Socrates describes as the appearance, or we could say the illusion of knowledge, right? Genuine knowledge comes from understanding and having a justification in your mind and having attempted to refute your beliefs, and your beliefs having withstood questioning rigorously. So you think, I've really, I know what I believe because I've examined it, I've scrutinized it, I've subjected it to questioning, I've debated it with other people. That's what the ancient Stoics, I think, would have said.
Oh, that's really interesting, Donald. Thank you for sharing that with us. One thing as I listen to you, I wonder, it sounds like that. So Socrates had this kind of he brought something different to philosophy, where before it was more of kind of memorizing things and more about regurgitation rather than thinking for yourself. And I think we could probably draw a lot of parallels to that today. And we have people that just kind of regurgitate the news they read without actually thinking for themselves. But I wonder, like, when that was going on, how was that received by the people that were in the kind of philosophical sphere of Socrates, kind of challenging what was the normal?
Badly. Like, basically, it didn't end well, as everyone knows, right? Spoiler alert, right? He drinks hemlock at the end, right? That's how it ends. However, that said, I would say it was more like extreme, like positive or negative reactions that Socrates encountered. Some people were thrilled by the Socratic method, and some people were horrified and offended by it. I'll tell you what I believe the difference was, and this may surprise you, right? I think older people tended to be more offended by the Socratic method. And the people that Socrates ended up questioning more, I believe, as time goes on, like a number of scholars have made this kind of rough observation, it looks like he becomes progressively more interested in engaging in philosophical dialogue with younger people. Like he says initially in Plato's Apology, he sought out the wisest men that he could, people with a reputation for wisdom, and he says he was disillusioned by that. He went to, I would assume, first of all, the sophists, who claimed to be wise. Protagoras was the first major sophist, and he was known as the wisest man alive. So if Socrates was looking for a wise man, that's your obvious candidate, right? So he went to these people and he found that the people with the greatest reputations for wisdom and the people that charged the highest fees for sharing their wisdom were often the ones that were most resistant to being questioned because they had a reputation to protect, right? Their ego got in the way, right? And that prevented them from developing genuine wisdom. Ironically, their reputation for wisdom acted as an obstacle to genuine wisdom because they couldn't allow themselves to ever be proven wrong, right? They couldn't, it was humiliating to them. Their money was at stake, their livelihood was at stake. Socrates, by contrast, didn't charge any fees and didn't claim to be wise. So that gave him some kind of freedom from the danger of arrogance or conceit or building this reputation around wisdom. And I think he questioned famous politicians and famous thinkers, and he got some things from it. Like he benefited from that. But I believe that Socrates was frustrated because he found that people with a reputation for wisdom weren't really open to questioning. Like they were they became dogmatic and rigid in their thinking. And that often happens even with experts today. And Socrates says in the Apology that he spoke to people that didn't have a reputation for wisdom. And he found in many cases they were more capable of wisdom than people who were supposedly famous intellectuals, right? So he spoke to poor people, people of low status. Well, Socrates famously spoke to prostitutes, people who were rich and poor. He spoke to foreigners as well as Athenians. He spoke to slaves, right? He spoke in one case, he has a dialogue with someone who might be portrayed as a dwarf. So a real kind of mixture of different characters, very diverse. That's unusual, right? Normally the sophists only spoke to privileged young Athenian male citizens, where they're primarily, they had their audience was very much lacking in diversity. Like it was mainly wealthy young men, like the sophists and other intellectuals used to teach to, like with some exceptions, right? A lot of the sophists were foreigners. Most of them were foreigners, right? So there's that aspect, I guess. And there are some female intellectuals around at the time, like Aspasia, for example, but that's unusual. right? And perhaps most controversially of all, Socrates did philosophy with women. Oh, in Athenian society, in classical Athens, women had a very restricted social status. Like a lot of women were barely allowed to leave the home. In some ways, women were treated worse than slaves. So it's exceptional to find somebody engaging in philosophical dialogue with a woman. So I think the people that Socrates spoke to, it would have been seen as quite controversial in a way. Also, by the way, Socrates' idea that you could learn virtue and that even slaves and women and poor people could learn virtue is obviously controversial, because the old view in Greek culture was that virtue is associated with noble birth, right? Aristocrats are virtue, and men are more virtuous than women, and Athenians are more virtuous than foreigners, right? They had this quite rigid and quite prejudiced view, as many cultures naturally do, right? And by questioning that and saying, well, I think women and slaves and foreigners are equally capable of virtue. Like, in fact, anybody can learn about virtue. Like, if they're questioned in the right way. That's a highly controversial view that really upsets the social hierarchy, potentially. It's no wonder they made him drink hemp. Other people were saying similar things in Athens, right? He wasn't the only person doing this. But of course, what he's doing is extremely controversial. So how was it received? Like, I think in a way, it might have been more appealing to the youth of Athens because nobody thought they were wise, right? So we see, some people wonder, why is Socrates talking to these young Athenians that, like sometimes seem quite arrogant and stuff. They seem like unlikely interlocutors. I think in part it's because they're more open to speaking their mind. Socrates says it's really important that people are honest with me, otherwise what's the point? Well, he's not going to get that from the sophists by definition. But young 15, 16, 17-year-old young guys are maybe just going to be more open with and more frank in debate and actually say what they genuinely believe, and maybe more willing to admit that they're wrong than some famous intellectual that tours the world giving lectures. And we have the same issue today. Many people today that are renowned for being experts and wise men. And, is it not in potentially a danger? It's a trap, like, to go down that path. If you're not careful, you can get locked into being associated, with a particular view, and it's difficult for you then to back out and change your mind.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it really sets up the next question I wanted to ask. You described how disruptive Socrates was in his own time and how controversial his questions could be. But if someone like Socrates appeared today, how do you think it would be received? Do you think we would metaphorically ask him or her to drink the hemlock again? Or would he still be prosecuted and attacked in some other way?
Well, we wouldn't be able to ask her to drink hemlock, but I think people would be tempted. I think he would rock the boat. It would be, he would be very controversial. He would have difficulty. Socrates said it was hard for him to engage in debate with sophists because the way that they spoke manipulated the audience. They would try and turn the audience against him. They would use ad hominem attacks. They would evoke fear and anger. They would speak at length in a way that was disguised to kind of, a way that was designed to kind of conceal the weaknesses in their argument. Socrates wanted to keep interrupting the sophists and questioning their premises, right? But you don't really see that. What we see on the internet now is a lot of social media, videos, articles, the same problem that we had with the sophists. You might read an article by a famous modern intellectual, and if you stop to think about it long enough, you might think, I don't even agree with the premise that the entire article is built upon. That's kind of where Socrates was at. But we don't get a chance, unless we're engaged in a conversation with somebody, to question the assumptions. And sometimes it's quite jarring to do that, to say, well, can we just back up? And someone would give Socrates a lecture on the nature of justice. And he would say, whoa, back up. How are you defining justice? What is justice? And so it's jarring to do that. It kind of interrupts the flow of the conversation. Usually the weakest part of somebody's argument is unspoken. It's the premise that they take for granted. It's the definitions that they're taking for granted. But so it's hard sometimes to wrench the conversation around and shift their attention around and get them to start examining what they're taking for granted. In other words, sometimes an entire speech can act as a smokescreen in a way, like covering up the weakest part of somebody's position. if you're not careful. So that sort of questioning attitude, I think today, again, would be difficult to implement. Like in social media, you don't really get a chance to do it. People just vent on social media. And if you say, hang on a minute, do your assumptions even make sense? Are the things that you're saying even logical? But people usually just don't respond to that. They'll block you probably or whatever, right? Or they just won't answer. I don't know. I in all honesty, I mean, I've spoken to many people over the years on social media and stuff, and I've tried experimenting a bit with doing philosophy. I don't think I've ever really seen anybody change their mind about anything. Like in a discussion, or it's pretty rare, I think. Usually if somebody says X, Y, and Z and you say, well, hang on a minute, here's a piece of evidence that contradicts what you just said. Normally they'll just call you names, ignore what you've said, change the subject, just like the sophists did, right? So, not everybody is open to these things. And I feel like something about social media actually magnifies this kind of evasiveness and rhetoric. It's not a place, generally speaking, it's not a good forum for sincere intellectual debate to take place, sadly.
Yeah, I really like how you connect that to our current situation, especially with social media in mind. It feels like there's so many modern sophists out there, people absolutely convinced that what they believe in is right and broadcasting it loudly. That reminds me of something you wrote in the book where you say people think they know something just by knowing its name. And that really stuck with me. Most people know the name Socrates, but they've never really gone deeper. So what new things did you learn about Socrates while researching the book? Things that went beyond just knowing his name and actually changed or deepened your understanding of him?
That's a hard question to answer in a sense, because there were so many things that I learned as a part of researching his life in more detail. And some of them are kind of subtle things that often it's a gradual thing when you change your mind about something. I think I came over time to see his military service and these other aspects of his life that we usually don't discuss as much as being more important than I'd previously realized. Actually, over time, funnily enough, I mean, my orientation is that my background's in cognitive behavioral therapy. So I came to reading Socrates kind of noticing the bits that were relevant to therapy. But funnily enough, as I've spent more and more time studying him, I've become more and more convinced that that there are chunks of what he's doing that obviously anticipate modern psychotherapy. I think I was naturally kind of understating at first what I was saying. And now, I'm more inclined to be a little bit more bold because I'm more convinced now. There are passages, particularly our two main sources for Socrates are that most famously the dialogues of Plato, but also we have many dialogues. We have about 40 odd dialogues from Xenophon, one of his other students that still survive today. Xenophon perhaps had as much or maybe even more influence on the Stoics than Plato did, perhaps. Certainly we're told Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, became a philosopher because he had read the second book of Xenophon's Memorabilia. Right? Not because he read Plato, but because he read Xenophon's account of Socrates. And so in Xenophon's Memorabilia, there are Socratic dialogues that jumped off the page to me as being clearly, almost a form of cognitive psychotherapy. There's bits where there's bits in Plato where Socrates is talking about really abstract metaphysical stuff. But then there's other bits where he clearly talks about psychological, psychotherapeutic stuff. He frames the Socratic method in those terms. But in Xenophon, he is straight up doing relationships counseling. Like, for instance, he had two friends that argue about their inheritance, and Socrates questions them in such a way to try and help them resolve the conflict in their relationship and deal with their anger. He does the same thing with his own son, Lamprocles, who's probably about 15 or so, and is really annoyed with his mum, Xanthippe, who's been nagging him. I mean, it's so mundane, right? He's not doing metaphysics. Like, he's using the Socratic method. He's using his questioning method to help people reevaluate the beliefs and assumptions that are causing them anger and damaging their relationships with friends and family members. He's doing cognitive therapy. And no one told me that. When I was training in cognitive therapy, people would say, well, there's like a couple of ideas in Stoicism that are kind of relevant. They didn't say, in some of these Socratic dialogues, he's just straight up doing a precursor of cognitive therapy. Like, he's literally working on people's anger and helping them with their relationships and stuff. I found that kind of mind-blowing. And so I'm bolder, I guess, now in asserting that Socrates is a granddaddy of modern psychotherapy and self-help. I think more people should become familiar with those bits of dialogue where he's really explicitly doing stuff. Also in Plato's Protagoras, Socrates almost like goes through the process of inventing a form of cognitive therapy. Like, not only is he kind of doing it, he's explaining how he arrives at the process. And he describes to Protagoras what he calls a method of rational measurement, is what Socrates calls it, which is essentially similar to what we today would call problem-solving therapy. It's a type of CBT where we get people to carefully evaluate the consequences of different courses of action and weigh up the costs and benefits of pros and cons in a rational way, like in order to. It's used as a treatment for clinical depression. There's good evidence supporting it. Socrates explains how he arrives at this method and says, we probably want to call it the method of rational measurement for pain and desire. And we use it to deal with irrational fears and stuff like that. He maps it out with Protagoras. So we've got a guy here basically inventing a form of cognitive therapy before our eyes. Right. Those are some of the things there might be things that have changed my mind about that, more of an epiphany to me. But in some ways, it just really profoundly reinforced some of the initial intuitions that I had about Socrates, and made me even more convinced of his relevance to modern self-improvement.
Since you've written so much about Marcus Aurelius, and since Socrates played such a big role in shaping the Stoics and Stoic philosophy, I'm curious to think if Socrates were able to look at Marcus Aurelius' life, what do you think he would think of Marcus Aurelius?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because Marcus supposedly constantly had on his lips a quote from Plato's Republic, which is something that Socrates says, that society won't flourish until either kings become philosophers or philosophers become kings. In other words, until rulers become wise and competent to rule wisely. And so if that's really what Marcus Aurelius went on about and believed, he saw himself as what we tend to call a philosopher king, right? He aspired to be a philosopher king. And so first of all, of course, that's something that Socrates himself was very concerned with. He was kind of skeptical about it. I mean, usually we almost see the negative side of this. Socrates is usually questioning Athenian statesmen or aspiring Athenian statesmen, the most obvious example being Alcibiades, who was Socrates' one of his best friends, one of his most famous followers, maybe even his lover, and was, a very prominent, very powerful Athenian statesman and military commander. You could see Alcibiades in some ways as kind of being a precursor of Marcus Aurelius. He's someone that Socrates is kind of trying to prepare to be a good and just ruler. He becomes the kind of commander-in-chief, the strategos autokratos of the whole Athenian military at one point. So Athens was a democracy, not an empire or a dictatorship. But Alcibiades was so powerful at one point, he was almost a de facto emperor, or on the verge of becoming one, a bit like Pericles, who was his guardian. Virtually his adoptive father. So Socrates looked at these statesmen and worked with some of them and was trying to prepare them to become wise and just rulers. And he would have looked at Marcus Aurelius perhaps and thought, maybe this guy is closer. He's been influenced by what I've been doing. It's taken 500 years, but eventually, we've got a ruler that's closer to actually becoming. I mean, one of Socrates' arguments, it's so simple and it's still very jarring today. Socrates, I think, often has very powerful images and very powerful arguments that are part of the power of them is their simplicity. So Socrates would look at people who were aspiring politicians and he would say to them, well, what are the qualities that would make somebody a really good politician? Is it not the case that they would need to understand what is in the best interest of society, that they'd have to have a genuine insight into what constitutes human well-being and the welfare collectively of society as a whole? And people would go, yeah, that's what would make someone a great statesman. And Socrates would say, well, how much time have you spent studying that? And they'd say, well, 0 time. And Socrates would say, well, you've never sought out any teachers who are experts on the nature of justice. You've not spent years reading books about it and stuff like that. And most of these young aspiring politicians didn't approach it like that. They just wanted to be really good at winning arguments. Like modern politicians, it was more about spin and PR and appearance and stuff like that. They wanted to appear just rather than actually being capable of understanding justice. And Socrates thought this was facile and superficial. So his main argument is like, you guys have spent no time trying to educate yourself in the knowledge that you would require to be a great statesman. Like, you don't know anything about what would constitute the flourishing of society or the welfare of the people in your care. Whereas Marcus Aurelius, say what you like about him, and he certainly wasn't perfect and didn't claim to be. Socrates wouldn't have seen him as perfect. Marcus Aurelius dedicated his life to genuinely attempting to study what was in the best interests of humankind. Like, you know, he certainly checks that box. Like, unlike Alcibiades, who was more concerned with appearances, at least initially, Marcus Aurelius was studying jurisprudence, studying philosophy. He was a massive nerd. And we can see from the Meditations, he really wants to try and understand what the human goal of life is, you know, what the best way to benefit his fellow man is, what the problems are that he's going to need to deal with in doing that. That's not how politicians normally think. And it's not how they think today. How many modern politicians have spent time attempting to really research and understand what would be in the best interest of society? You know, many of them are just businessmen, or, you know, they're kind of career politicians, or their main interest is in how to acquire power rather than how they would use that power wisely, you know? This is Socrates' simple argument. Like, how much time have you spent trying to educate yourself in the knowledge that would allow you to use power wisely? 0 time. There's something wrong with that. That would be like going to see a doctor and you say, how much time have you spent studying medicine? And they say, none. Like, I didn't think I'd have to study medicine. I thought, you know, I just needed to look like a doctor. Like, and convince other people that I looked like a good doctor. But I haven't spent any actual time studying medicine. How crazy is that? That we elect people to power who have got no idea how to use power wisely. That was what he was concerned about. If that's our test, Marcus Aurelius really seems to pass at least that test. He's really concerned with educating himself, you know, from 12 years old. Like, no, he spent his entire life. And then we see his private notes. He's really kind of exploring these questions very deeply. So here's a guy who genuinely cares about what's in the interest of mankind. I think Socrates would definitely admire that in Marcus. But also, you know, the question you've asked me, I should have maybe answered it. In Plato's Gorgias, somebody says to Socrates, what do you think about the great king of Persia, like the wealthiest man in the world, right? Do you think he's fulfilled or not? And Socrates says, I don't know, I've never met him, which is the best answer, right? So Socrates is saying, I don't know, this is like a weird abstract question, right? The guy's rich, right? We know that. Do I know if he's wise or virtuous? It's hard to say. Like, I just know rumors about him, you know, like we read in the newspapers today or something like that. I'd need to meet him in person and kind of question him a bit to try and really get a sense of his character and why he's doing the things that he's doing. Right. So if we were to say, how would Socrates judge Marcus Aurelius? I think it presents the same problem. It's hard to say. Like, Socrates would say, I'd need to meet the guy. Like, and actually, maybe the Meditations gives us almost a glimpse of what's going on in Marcus's mind. But Socrates has said, I need to really understand his decision-making process, what's going on in his mind to get a sense of his character. It's difficult to tell from a distance.
Donald, something I wanted to ask you about is, you know, obviously we're going to have some listeners that have read your previous book, you know, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, about Marcus Aurelius. And then, you know, I just want to kind of understand, you know, what would be the difference, you know, how would you explain sort of the differences between this book and that book as far as the, you know, what the readers can expect from it?
Well, I mean, in this book, Socrates, well, first of all, Socrates is, I'd say this maybe is a slightly superficial answer, but Marcus is very much, the story is about the Roman Empire. And the story of Socrates is a different time, a different place. It's the birthplace of democracy, the Peloponnesian War. So a very different historical environment. Still the ancient world. It's ancient Greece we're talking about now, in a democracy rather than an empire. So this context is very different. In terms of the content, in terms of the philosophy, which I think is probably more what you have in mind, as I said earlier, Socrates is more explicitly focused on the process, on his famous method of asking questions. So definitely from this book, there's more emphasis on that. For the Stoics, we're handed down these techniques and strategies, you know, like coping skills today in therapy. But we don't learn as much about the methodology of philosophical questioning and its significance. We have more opportunity. I think the Stoics were aware of that. It's just not perhaps reflected that clearly in their literature, apart from in a few bits of Epictetus, like I mentioned earlier. But it's front and center in Socrates. Why would we want to ask ourselves these questions? How do we ask ourselves these questions? I think, like I said a moment ago, we get these amazing images in the ancient texts. Outside Athens, a couple of days' walk, there's this place that's like something out of Lord of the Rings, right? You can still go there today. It's one of the most magnificent historical archaeological sites in the world. Everyone should go there. It's called Delphi, and it's in the mountains, and there's a huge temple complex there dedicated to the god Apollo, the son of Zeus. And Apollo, in a sense, is kind of like the patron god of philosophy as well in ancient Greece. And outside the entrance to the temple, there was engraved on one of the pillars the words "Gnothai Siauton," which means know thyself. And this became like a theme that dominates Greek philosophy. Socrates is shown repeatedly returning to the question of what it means to know thyself. It's clearly linked with what he means by wisdom. Philosophy means the love of wisdom, and Socrates takes that quite literally, as do the Stoics. The goal of philosophy has got something to do with cherishing and understanding wisdom. And wisdom is the core of virtue for the Stoics and Socrates. All the other virtues depend on having this particular type of moral wisdom. But how can we achieve wisdom without knowing ourselves, without really gaining some insight into our own minds and our characters, our strengths and weaknesses? You know, Socrates thinks this is what the god is commanding us, to become wise by knowing ourselves. And in the dialogue with Alcibiades, the first Alcibiades, which may or may not be written by Plato, I don't care if it's written by Plato. If it's not written by Plato, it's written by someone that sounds like Plato. But there's a scholarly debate about who wrote it, right? First Alcibiades, Socrates says, what does this mean? And he says, imagine it's like the god was saying to you that your eye should learn to see itself. He's saying your mind should learn to know itself. Imagine by analogy that he had said your eye should learn to see itself. How on earth would it do that? And Alcibiades says, I don't know, I guess it would look in the mirror. And Socrates says, yeah, so what would be a mirror for the human soul? And basically what he's implying, I think, is that another person would be a mirror for the human soul. And the process of using the Socratic method or engaging in a dialogue with other people about the most important questions in life, their most fundamental assumptions and values, would be the closest thing that we have to a mirror in which we could examine our own soul. Now, this really resonates with me because, again, I'm not a professional classicist, my first degree is in philosophy, but I'm not a professional academic philosopher. I chose to go down a clinical path. So when I look at the classics, I do it from the perspective of psychotherapy. And so different things strike me than would strike a professional philosopher or classicist. And one of them is a therapist. Therapists learn from their clients. You know, we engage constantly in a sort of dialogue with the clients that we have in therapy. We all are very aware of our blind spots in life. Everyone knows that it's easier to help other people solve their problems. It's easier to at least to understand other people's problems than it is to gain insight into our own, because we have blind spots and biases in our thinking, right? We can't see our own problems clearly. We can't view them objectively. So how do we get past that problem? How can we become an eye that sees itself clearly, right? And Socrates says we do it through doing what Socrates does all day, obviously. Sometimes the answer to Socrates' questions is kind of obvious because it's what he's doing, right? The mirror is what Socrates does all day, like engaging in philosophical dialogue with open-minded individuals and really collaboratively examining their fundamental assumptions about the nature of wisdom, nature of justice, the nature of courage, and the most important questions in life. So, I mean, I think what's different about this book is more emphasis on the psychological significance of that type of questioning. I'll throw in a couple of observations that I think are particularly important. So again, to go back to what we were saying earlier about the problem with the sophists and modern self-help, I think there's a problem with modern self-help literature, right? So it's that sometimes that shocks people. A guy was interviewing me the other day and he said, Donald, do you have a problem with self-help literature? And I'd never been asked a question like that before, but I'm glad that I was. And I thought, yeah, I do. Yeah, because there is a problem with self-help literature. I'm now more emboldened perhaps than in the past to say that. Of course there's a problem with self-help literature. It's glaringly obvious there's a problem with it. The internet is flooded with self-improvement advice, right? And yet, how improved has society been by it? Right? Not as much as it should have been. We're awash in this stuff. Is there much evidence of improvement going on? I don't really see it. But as a therapist, it's glaringly obvious, because any psychotherapist will tell you that most of the clients would describe themselves as self-help junkies. And the initial session in psychotherapy, we usually ask clients, hey, what have you done to deal with this problem in the past? Have you had therapy before? Have you done life coaching? Do you do meditation and things like that? And clients will tell you all of their self-help, self-improvement attempts. Some people will tell you they've seen a dozen therapists in the past. They've been in umpteen courses. They have a whole bookshelf filled with all the best-selling self-help books that they read. They follow all the YouTube channels. And then the therapist kind of, sometimes more tactfully than I'm about to, would maybe raise the question, how come you ended up in therapy? Why are you sitting in my chair in my consulting room then? Something doesn't add up about this in the face of every psychotherapist every day that they're working with clients, right? That's how glaringly obvious it is. All of these clients, or certainly many of them, are immersed in self-help literature, and yet they end up in the therapist consulting room over and over again because they're kind of struggling to cope with problems and not succeeding somehow. Now, there are multiple reasons for that, right? Why self-help isn't more helpful. It's not as helpful as it should be for some reason. Partly it's got to do with the blind spots and biases we have. So you'll often find that people are using self-help, but they're trying to improve the wrong area of their life. I could talk all day long about this, but I'll give a kind of abbreviated version here. I think the most obvious instance of that is anger, right? Anger is naturally an externalizing emotion. People that are depressed or anxious typically try and seek help for their depression or their anxiety. Angry people seldom seek help for their anger, right? Angry people think, if I'm angry, I think you guys are the ones that need therapy, not me, right? There's something wrong with you. It's your problem, buddy, not mine. So that's kind of how angry people think. They externalize blame. And that kind of turns them away from therapy usually. They do end up in therapy if they're also depressed or also anxious, or if their wife tells them they have to go to therapy or she's going to divorce them, right? Or if they're in a school and the teacher says, you need anger management, kid, or you're in the military or you're in prison or something like that. So often in institutions, people are told that they should go and have anger. But angry people, if they're predominantly angry, they tend not to seek therapy themselves. Now, I don't think it's any coincidence that if I go to certain self-help communities or on the videos posted by certain self-help experts or self-improvement experts, and I look at the comments, there's a lot of angry young men, in particular, right? Because they're doing self-improvement left, right, and center, but they're not doing anything to improve their anger, because often they don't even see it as a problem. But it's pretty obvious to everyone else that it's a problem. You don't need to be a psychotherapist, a psychologist, or a philosopher to look down the comments and think, these guys have got anger problems. Oh, anyone could tell you that, right? It's astounding that they can't see it themselves, in a sense. But in another sense, it's obvious, because angry people have these blind spots, right? So one of the problems here is research tells us that when people become, another problem here is that research tells us that when people become overly dependent on a single coping strategy, they often exhibit poorer emotional resilience, right? And self-help tends to teach roles. Now, it seems odd to me that one of the best-selling self-help books in recent years is Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, or whatever it's called. And not only is it called that, that book has a foreword that it opens with that valorizes the whole concept of rigid rule following, that it compares to following the 10 Commandments in the Bible, like Moses' 10 Commandments, right? The guy that wrote the foreword, who wasn't Jordan Peterson, but it prefaces the book, says, it's not the 10 suggestions, it's the 10 Commandments. Now, that seemed odd to me when I read it, because it flies in the face of what research actually tells us about modern behavioral psychology, right? There's a problem with rule-governed behavior. It leads to rigid coping, which usually isn't good for mental health, right? So it's not what I expect to see in a self-improvement. Modern psychotherapists are generally really sensitive to this. They're aware of it. If you tell people you should be more assertive, right? You should stand up straight. You should always be honest with people and speak your mind. There's a tendency for people to follow those rules so rigidly that they end up doing them in situations or in ways that backfire. And the more they backfire and the more stressed out they become, the more, when the more people are under stress, the more rigid the thinking tends to become. So, what might seem like, it's just a rule, I can adapt it to different situations when you're composed. But when someone walks up to you in the street and spits in your face, or when you're having a big argument with your spouse, you're more likely to apply these rules much more rigidly and stupidly, than would be in your best interests. So what's the opposite of this kind of rigid and flexible approach to coping? Advice that works in one situation doesn't necessarily work in others. Strategies that work in one situation don't work in others. I'll give you a quick example. Mindfulness might be very useful as a practice in some situations, but if you're in the middle of giving a wedding speech, it's possible that in some cases, trying to practice mindfulness as a way of coping with social anxiety, especially if you have a lot of social anxiety, is going to heighten your self-focused attention, which we know is likely to amplify your anxiety even more, right? So some situations where even something fairly harmless like mindfulness can actually backfire. Another example is if someone has hypochondria or severe health anxiety, where they're constantly checking their body for symptoms of illness, and they notice even the slightest change in their heart rate or twinge in their body. You think, oh my God, maybe I'm having a stroke or something, right? Practicing mindfulness can just magnify that if you're not careful. So any self-help strategy could be used foolishly or used wisely. It can be used flexibly or it can be used rigidly. Self-help literature tends to just dish out quite rigid advice. And so that's one of the reasons that it backfires. So, what do we need there? We need to learn something that psychologists call coping flexibility, which is the wisdom to select between different types of strategies in different situations, and the wisdom to modify, tweak our strategies so that we're being more adaptive in response to situations. So, in other words, hate to break it to you kids, to think for yourself, right? And that's what Socrates wants to teach. Socrates, literally, I don't mean to pick on Jordan Peterson, but we may as well. One of Jordan Peterson's rules is to always speak your mind, right? Now, I'm sure in the rest of his writing, he qualifies that, despite what it says in the foreword to his book about it being like the 10 Commandments, right? But by coincidence, that happens to be one of the pieces of advice that Socrates actually critiques in Xenophon's dialogues. He says to a young man called Euthydemus, how would you define justice? How would you define virtue and wisdom in a social situation? And he says, I don't know, for example, not lying and always telling the truth. That's exactly what one of the rules that Jordan Peterson gives us. Socrates says, what if your friend is suicidal and he asks you where you've hidden his dagger? And Euthydemus says, okay, well, that's like an exception, isn't it? Then I might tell a white lie because I'm trying to protect the guy. Socrates says, what if you're an elected general and you're lying to the enemy in warfare? And they go, well, that's different, right? That's an exception. Socrates says, what if you've got a young child and you're trying to give them medicine, but they'll only take it if you conceal it in their food? And they say, well, that's different. It's a normal thing. So Euthydemus has to admit that it's more complex than this kind of rule would imply, and that wisdom would consist in being able to spot these, because Socrates has got this extraordinary wisdom, to be able to creatively identify exceptions to general principles. You can think outside the box, to use a horrible modern cliche, right? And so I think this book, to go back, if you can remember the question, how does this book differ? Back when we asked that question, what it does is focus more on the ways that Socratic questioning can help us, and how, for example, it could go beyond the sort of strategies that we get in Stoicism to develop the underlying cognitive flexibility and coping flexibility that I believe is actually missing from a lot of modern self-help literature, and it really is known to be, from modern research on stress and coping, is known to be integral to developing genuine emotional resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. We love that answer, and thank you for diving into the differences and giving some great examples, and also bringing this self-help movement, right? And what I really liked is that you focus on cognitive flexibility, and that really resonated. As we start to wrap this episode up, Socrates feels like politics fills in the gaps in a different way, more psychological. But Socrates also had a strong view of the responsibility. But my question is, as we start to kind of wrap this conversation up, democracy? How does Socrates' approach change the way we think about self-improvement today, especially compared to
I'll say a little bit about that. I'll just step back a little bit first and say something odd. But when we read the Socratic dialogues, so we mainly know about Socrates through dialogues. We have some anecdotes and stuff as well, right? Which is odd. Dialogues are weird. It's a genre that's almost extinct now. Like nobody writes philosophical, or very rarely now do people write philosophical dialogues, right? In fact, many people today wouldn't have the patience to read them. We want sound bites now. Dialogues take a little bit more patience, right? But they have certain advantages, I believe, psychologically as a teaching aid, if you like. Despite a dialogue is a little bit like a play, but with minimal scene setting and minimal action, usually it varies, and a lot of words, a lot of discussion, right? And so, despite the fact that there is some scene setting and there's some reference to historical events and there are some historical characters, nevertheless, when people read those dialogues, they often get this weird feeling that Socrates is walking through pleasant groves, casually talking about quite abstract things in a way that's pretty divorced from like any historical context, right? All philosophy tends to come across a little bit like that. It's kind of done in an ivory tower or something, or it's done in this kind of weird abstract space, right? We don't usually think of it as being really historically grounded and immersed. When I wrote this book, I tried to get beyond that by filling in a lot of the context. Socrates is talking to people that are about to engage in huge military expeditions. He's talking to people that are engaged in these massive political dramas, like key figures. Socrates himself is fighting in battles, right? So he's immersed in politics and military campaigns and their significance, right? That I don't think comes through as clearly to modern readers of Plato's dialogues or Xenophon's dialogues as it would have maybe to an ancient Athenian who was more aware of who the figures were and what was going on at the time, the significance of the wider context. So I think presenting things in that way maybe helps people. Athens and that history is incredibly relevant to us today. We're dealing with the early days of European democracy when we look at Socrates and, also the collapse of Athenian democracy. Democracy was a great system, but it has weaknesses. The next generation saw those weaknesses, began to exploit them, and then subsequent generations soon were exploiting them to the absolute maximum. They were becoming corrupt, there was bribery, threats, exploiting the legal system, manipulating the electorate or the assembly in this case. And we see that happening in American politics right now, very similar things. I'm not going to label the point, but Cleon, like one of the most famous demagogues in ancient Athens, I think has quite a lot in common with Donald Trump, right? I'm not just saying that as a kind of critique. I think they're quite similar characters. Like the things that people perhaps even admire them for are similar. Cleon was very brash and outspoken. He was a successful businessman rather than a noble. He attacked the establishment like draining the swamp. People loved the fact that he was unpolished and frank and outspoken and could be quite insulting. He was accused of corruption. He accused other people of corruption. Like the way that played out, I think clearly is similar, whether you like Trump or don't like him, is obviously kind of similar to how he presents himself and how he's presented by other people, right? So Socrates watched Athenian democracy falter and collapse into a dictatorship. Okay, sorry everyone, hate to warn you, but what actually happened? We're kind of pretty close now to what, let's hope it doesn't go the same way that the Athenian democracy did when it ended up in rule by the 30 tyrants, like in Athens devolved into a civil war. Like that's what happened next. Like it's quite unsettling when you think about that, right? Socrates lived through that. He had an uncanny ability to survive all of this stuff. Like he survived the plague of Athens. He survived all these battles in which thousands of Athenians around him were slaughtered. He was threatened with execution multiple times. They didn't get him until he was about 71 or 72. Eventually made him drink hemlock. No wonder he wasn't afraid of dying. Like by that point, he probably thought, it's old hat to me. Socrates must have thought he was going to die at least a dozen times, like prior to that, right? So the historical context, I think, changes the kind of emotional significance and maybe even the meaning of some of these dialogues. So to come back to how does it relate to modern politics, Socrates doesn't clearly favor one political system over another. Some people even think he favored the oligarchic system over the democracy. I'm not so sure about that. I think Socrates is sometimes portrayed as saying things that actually sound like they favor the democracy, but he's almost kind of bipartisan in terms of the type of political system. So his emphasis is on something else. His emphasis is on the fact that the people who are ruling, whoever they are, need to be competent to rule, right? This is his bottom line, right? It's a bit like saying, either kings should become philosophers or philosophers should become kings. So that sounds a bit silly to us, because it's like a philosopher to us is somebody that works in a university. What Socrates really means is either our rulers need to become wise or our wise men need to become rulers, right? People with power need to have wisdom. Or to say the same thing in different words, the powerful need to be competent to utilize their power wisely, right? That's basically all that he's driving at, right? And that was the constant theme in what he said. So he thinks when we're electing someone, we need to know how to check their wisdom, like how to evaluate them and figure out whether they're actually suitable for the job. You know, we need to spot if they keep contradicting themselves, if they seem to be easily swayed by other people, if they seem to be confident in speaking about subjects that they're not qualified in. You know, like those are things that should be warning signs to us. You know, we need to look for evidence that somebody actually has studied a subject enough to understand it. They care enough about a subject to have studied it. You know, they're consistent in what they say. Yeah, and so there's some evidence of expertise and understanding on their part. But also the electorate. In his case, the assembly. The Athenian democracy worked a little bit differently from the way our democracy worked. So all of the male citizens could gather together and directly vote on things, a bit like a sort of, I don't know, like a direct democracy rather than a representational democracy. So Socrates thinks the biggest problem is rhetoric. The guys whose whole profession is to study how to manipulate the electorate, like spin doctors or like consultants today, or so the social media, the way that it works today. Like there's a whole business of trying to dupe the electorate. And that's what the sophists were all about. They charged a huge amount of money to train politicians to be able to win arguments about subjects that they don't even understand, right? They just got really good at winning arguments and cheating at winning arguments, like by evoking emotions, by blackening the names of their opponents. That was the first thing people did when the democracy started to collapse. Like, rather than attacking policies of their, they used to debate policies in the assembly. And then there's a point in which they start, if you're disagreeing with someone's policy, what you start doing is attacking their character. The ad hominem argument, like the crudest piece of sophistry, like basically is one of the first things like that happens. And then information starts getting presented very selectively by each side, you know, and then more and more emotively. Like, so they figure out these simple strategies that we see every day. And Socrates thought, look, if people are going to participate in democracy, they need to be protected against this, right? They need to question this. They need to understand how rhetoric works so that they don't fall victim to it. And I think if he saw, if in a way what you're asking is what advice would he give us today? He would say, you guys need philosophy, like in the sense that you need to understand the drugs that you're taking. You need to understand what's in these drugs that you're taking. Every day on social media, you're drinking from a fire hose of BS, right? And you don't even take time to understand what's going on, right? So everybody needs to become far more educated in the ways in which they're being manipulated by marketing, by social media, by politicians who are, and I don't even credit these people with the name politician, right? Who in their right mind, you know, really thinks that some of these people that stand for election are genuinely politicians? You know, like it's insulting to refer to them as that. People say there's a lot of arguments about politics on social media. That seems odd to me. Generally, I don't see people arguing about politics at all. Like, you know, they're just trading insults and stuff. How is this even politics that they're discussing? You know, like mostly when I go on Twitter or something like that, I just see a lot of people. Often there's a lot of stuff in just randomly in the feed about people accusing politicians of being pedophiles or of like dubious sex scandals or corruption scandals or Photoshop pictures and stuff. Like, how is any of this political debate at all in any sense of the word, right? It doesn't even deserve to be given that kind of title. It's beneath that. But we have to understand what's going on here. We have to, I guess, in a way, be a little bit more balanced and rounded in our thinking. We've got to understand common thinking errors. You know, we've got to spot the ad hominem when it's being used and be wary of that. We've got to spot when information is being presented selectively or in an emotive way. I think Socrates would warn us that if we don't really understand a little bit about rhetoric and a little bit about logic, we're going to be taking drugs without even knowing what we're taking, right? And I use that analogy, like, the ancient philosophers compare rhetoric to a drug. It'd be like we're just swallowing pills and we've got no idea what's in them. Like, that's what happens when you go on social media. Have a better understanding and some insight into the nature of the manipulation that's going on, and a way of defending yourself against it by questioning, some of the assumptions, by learning to also a kind of intellectual humility. Socrates thought that we need to recognize that ignorance isn't dangerous, right? Ironically, the thing that you fear most, like, people are frightened of admitting their ignorance. They're frightened of ignorance, but actually it would be much healthier for them to acknowledge and admit their ignorance. Because somebody, for example, who is completely ignorant of medicine or medical research or epidemiology, for example, but believes that they're an expert and know about it, might be on the Joe Rogan show talking about it, for instance, hypothetically, every other week, right? Or, during the pandemic, everybody was suddenly an expert on epidemiology, right? It's a classic example of the sort of Dunning-Kruger effect. This is exactly what Socrates was warning us against. So Socrates says, if you admit that you're ignorant, if you go, I don't understand how medical research works, right? But you have to study research methods to do CBT at postgraduate level, right? So, I don't pretend to be an expert on these things, but I know enough to kind of realize when people are talking complete and utter hogwash, right? And they don't even understand the terminology that they're using. That's all over the internet, though, sadly. But understanding that there are limits to your knowledge, like, and having the intellectual humility to admit that, means that you're more likely to seek out genuine experts and sources of reliable knowledge. Whereas if you're conceited and arrogant and you think you're an expert about things that you don't really have knowledge about, then you're not going to seek genuine expertise and sources of information. You're going to allow your ignorance to guide you. Socrates sometimes calls this double ignorance. He says ignorance isn't a problem, but being ignorant about your ignorance is the real problem. And that's one of the main things that the Socratic method sets out to cure. So I think this applies to modern politics. It seems to me also that most of the things that people call political debates are actually, in many cases, factual debates about health, economics, often about economics, right? I mean, how many of these politicians are experts on economics, right? None of them? Hardly any of them, right? How much time have they spent studying economics? Yeah, but they seem to act like they've got expertise in that area. It's just kind of puzzling to me. And they really disagree with each other about something that they've never actually studied. What's going on in the world? All of these people are arguing about things that they've never made any attempt to study, like with absolute confidence and totally polarized views, right? People like loggerheads arguing about vaccines and epidemiology who have no knowledge whatsoever of medical research methods. It's like a circus, right? But recognizing and having a kind of degree of intellectual humility and saying, I don't know for sure whether raising taxes or lowering them is going to be in the long-term interest of society. I'm not an economist. I maybe have an impression, I maybe have some opinions, but recognizing that that's all it is, right? Recognizing it's just an opinion, it's just an assumption in an area where you lack expertise would mean that you remain open-minded about it and curious and willing to listen to other people. For some reason, that's kind of gone out of the window on the internet. Like, people get tunnel vision and locked into views about health research, economics, I'm sure other areas where they don't have any genuine knowledge at all. And that prevents them from acquiring any genuine knowledge or understanding. So Socrates wants us to be more open-minded, but to do that, we need to admit our ignorance. That Socrates was always emphasizing his ignorance and his intellectual humility for that reason. The sophists place themselves very much, if you imagine the teaching dynamic, there's a teacher and there's a student traditionally, right? Didactic teaching. The sophists put themselves in the position of the expert. They call themselves experts. They're the teacher. Socrates, strangely, if you think about it, places himself more in the role of the student, but he's an extraordinary student. He's really good at asking questions and really good at listening to what other people are saying and scrutinizing it. So he'd be like this guy. You're at a lecture and there's a guy in the audience who's asking questions that are more interesting than the stuff that the speaker is saying, if you can imagine that, right? Which is kind of cool in a way, but you can also see how that would upset some people. Some people would turn around and start listening to this guy more. You think, this guy's questions are really interesting, right? Other people would just get annoyed and say, can you just shut up? Like, well, I want to, listen to this guy, let him get on with the talk. That depends whether they just are there because they want to have their ego stroked and agree with whatever the speaker is saying, or whether they're there to really try and understand the subject. And if they care about truth, they might be more interested in these really insightful questions that they're getting from somebody in the audience. But Socrates kind of avoids this trap of intellectual conceit by constantly questioning himself and acknowledging the limits of his understanding. But by doing the opposite of the sophists and claiming that he lacked wisdom, that meant that he didn't have to be defensive. He's often admitting that he's made a mistake and backtracking and changing his view. And the irony is, Socrates says this, and Epicurus famously said it. I'll kind of wrap up there with a little paradox that I like. Many of these things you can teach to children, right? I mean, that's the beauty of sometimes Socrates says things that are very complex and subtle, and sometimes they just lead to little observations that a child would understand. One of the ancient dialogues, one of the Socratic dialogues, has Socrates say that talking to a wise man is like being bitten by a small animal, like a mosquito. And at first, maybe you don't even notice that it's happened. But then days later, you start to kind of like itch and it kind of starts to bother you, like a question that they asked. So we often have that with Socrates. We think, I'm not sure I agree with him, or I don't know if I really get the point of his question. But 10 years later, you might still be thinking about it. Yeah. So one of the things he says is that in a debate, particularly in a rhetorical debate, like what people call debates you see on YouTube now between public intellectuals, right? Where they're really just trying to win the debate, right? By convincing the audience. Usually these are almost useless at actually getting to truth. That's not how we do science for a reason. Winning a debate is not the same as proving something scientifically or philosophically, right? It's not a good gauge of truth, but people seem to think that it is, right? So the sophists trained people to win debates, right? It's all about appearances in a sense. It's a dupe, it's a trick, it's an illusion. Socrates often lost his arguments, right? But nevertheless kind of came across, like he'd asked more interesting questions. He said at one point to the sophists, I think the person in a debate who loses actually gains more than the person who wins. That blew their minds. They thought that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard anybody say. Like, how is the person that loses a debate better off? And Socrates says, because somebody who kind of loses a debate might actually learn something. They might change their opinion, right? But the person that wins doesn't gain anything, like, except maybe a round of applause or something, but that's worthless. Who cares about that? Like, somebody who genuinely loses, if it's really in the pursuit of wisdom and truth, and they realize that their argument is flawed, it might be painful. It might be kind of humiliating to them, but they've gained a little glimmer of wisdom, at least. I think that attitude is completely lacking from modern intellectual debates online and from the way that most people approach social media as well. That recovering some of that kind of intellectual humility from modeling it from Socrates, perhaps, I think could be useful, could be very healthy. And I draw another analogy in therapy. If clients who come into cognitive therapy were right about everything, right? Even some of their most deeply held beliefs, like they're not going to change. Right? The only way a client in therapy changes in cognitive therapy is by admitting that something that they assumed was true might not be the whole story. Might be mistaken. Maybe they've been jumping prematurely to conclusions or making an overgeneralization or something like that. Right? And that's painful. Like, some people are more open to it than others. Some people find it really hard to change their beliefs. But, it's obvious in therapy that you need to do that in order to benefit from cognitive therapy. That's why I think that aspect of Socrates is so important to self-improvement.
Donald, thank you very much for that question. And we have a few rapid questions here at the end. Some of the listeners might already be more familiar with Stoicism, others might not be, and the philosophical way and how we look at it. And maybe you've touched on this a little bit before, but why is it important for people to read this book? And more specifically, because some people might be hearing about Socrates for the first time, really in depth. Why should someone care about Socrates today? What can his approach to philosophy actually do for someone living in the modern world? So maybe in a few sentences you can touch on that and really hone into the relevance of Socratic philosophy for us today.
Because Socrates is the great granddaddy of all self-help and modern psychotherapy, but we went astray and ended up becoming more like the sophists. We became too rigid and dogmatic in our thinking about self-improvement advice. And in a sense, that's obvious. We all know that self-improvement isn't really improving us as much as it should be. And Socrates at the beginning of the tradition was doing something different. Like, he was much more focused on the process of acquiring wisdom by asking questions. So by going back to Socrates, we potentially get beyond the limitations of modern self-improvement advice and beyond the kind of rigid rule following that's come to dominate it, and we start to understand self-improvement and philosophy more as a process of learning how to ask ourselves questions more effectively and become more
Oh, that's really
flexible
great.
in our thinking.
This has been a fantastic interview, Donald, and you have definitely succeeded. A little secret. You are probably the reason why I always loved Marcus Aurelius so much that I even named my dog that. But now you've definitely convinced me that Socrates may or may not be a front runner for my next favorite philosopher. So it's been really great how you've presented the information in the book. And I think one piece, and this is just one of my favorite lines that I read from the book that kind of encapsulates the impact that Socrates has, is you say, philosophy in his hands began to resemble a sort of medicine applied to the mind rather than the body. And that's really like what I'm taking from this book, taking from this conversation, is this idea of taking philosophy and not just discussing it and understanding its maxims and things like that, but really applying it to our life and applying it to our mind. But really what I'm interested in is what's next? Is there another person that we're going to focus on in the How to Think series?
Well, I don't have a good candidate for that at the moment. I'm still I'm thinking about whether there might be another book. I haven't reached a decision. Authors are always speaking to publishers. So I've been speaking to one of my publishers about writing another biography. And I chose to write it paradoxically about someone who many people think it's impossible to write a biography of. But I think there might be a way of doing it. All right. So I'll leave it at that because I don't want to kind of say exactly who it is. But the main book that I've been pitching to my main publisher is about anger, about the philosophy and psychology of anger. Because as time goes on, when we talk about Socrates and Marcus Aurelius, both of these traditions put a lot of emphasis on contemplating your own mortality. And how when we contemplate our own mortality, it kind of changes our priorities in life, right? And so partly from doing that, and partly occasionally from having brushes with death and thinking about, I don't know how much time I've got left. What if the next book that I write is the last book that I write? What does it need to be about? It made me think, I really want to write something that's not so much about a historical figure, but that focuses a lot more on a specific problem. And that I think is maybe the biggest problem, the most important thing to tackle and address in society. And for me, that's anger. It's also something where I think we can help people. For instance, psychologists know loads of things about anger that would profoundly impact many people's day-to-day lives, and also have profound implications for the way that we consume social media, the way that we perceive what's going on in politics. Wars are fought. Genocide is committed as a result of anger. People are murdered because of anger. People get divorced because of anger. It's a big deal in society, both at the individual level and at the collective level. But most people have no idea what psychological research tells us about anger. Politicians are shouting and raging and stoking anger all the time. Most people couldn't tell you what anger is, how it functions, what the consequences of it are, or what the remedies for it are. And yet we know a great deal about all of those questions. So it seems odd to me that there's this kind of knowledge gap between what research tells us and what the public know, and that really seems to me that it should be bridged. People should be educated more, particularly children, about what we know already, for example, about these problems. And for instance, it's well established that the more angry people are, the more they tend to underestimate risk, right? So people who underestimate risk tend to place themselves and other people in more danger. So, for that reason, we might want to question the behavior of angry politicians. Is their anger not biasing their judgments so they underestimate the risks to society? That's definitely something we'd want to be a bit wary of, right? There are many other issues similar to that. that we would want to address. So it's a very interesting, very dramatic subject. That's what I'm hoping to write a book about next. And drawing on, I mean, as you know, we have an entire book by Seneca called On Anger. And we also have loads of stuff from Marcus Aurelius about anger. Plutarch has an essay on anger. We've got amazing historical sources about the philosophy of anger, and they really help to amplify and reinforce stuff that state-of-the-art psychological research happens to be telling us. The Stoics said anger is temporary madness. We now know anger is associated with lots of cognitive biases, so they went far wrong. Like, I think by combining these two things, we can take the facts and make them a more resonant and more meaningful to people, and maybe connecting them with some stories from philosophy as well. So I'm hoping that's a good area to focus on, and something that people would enjoy reading about and genuinely benefit from. It's a great debate they had about, in the ancient world, they disagreed. And this is the same, it's one of the fundamental debates today about whether is there such a thing as moderate anger, healthy anger, justifiable anger. I think that in a way that debate isn't that complicated, and research can help us to answer it. But we just never get a chance these days to kind of really carefully weigh the evidence up for and against and think it through systematically. So I think a book is a good opportunity to do that patiently and properly and go, what do the Aristotelians and the Stoics say differently about anger, and how does that relate to what the research shows us? If nothing else, whatever side someone comes down on, I think they benefit from really exploring the question patiently.
Thank you for listening to the Via Stoica podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and leaving a review. Your feedback will help us reach more like-minded people on the journey to self-improvement. If you want to get in touch with us or find more information, you can go to viastoica.com, your one-stop platform for all things Stoicism and living better. And remember, virtue is the only good.